This video is sponsored by Timbro. In last week's video, we were learning how to recognize the chords of a song just by listening to them, just by ear. But in that video, we were only looking at examples in the major key. But the thing is, the chords of a key take on a different quality in the minor key, in the minor context. So today we're going to look at all of the chords we could hear in the minor key, and not only think about how they sound and how we can recognize them, but look at famous examples of them in context. Also, stick around to the end of the video where I'll play you some chord progressions and it'll be up to you to identify what those chords are by ear. So let's start with the one chord, the tonic chord. If we were in the key of C, for example, C minor, it would be a C minor chord. Now, just like in the major key, the quality of the one chord, of the tonic, is feeling completely at rest. It's our home, it's the center of gravity. If we went through a chord progression like this, 1, 4, 5, when we go back to 1, we feel complete. We've arrived at the destination. That's the sound you want to look out for with the tonic chord, in both major or minor. But with minor, we need to identify that it's a minor chord. So we want to look out for the chord quality. That slightly darker, insular, solemn sound of the minor chord versus the bright major chord. The minor chord has that slightly more serious quality to it. And a good example of that serious minor sound on the tonic chord is the song Don't Speak by No Doubt, where we get an opening just sat on the one chord of C minor.
You and me.
So now let's look at the fifth chord of the key. So if we're in the key of A minor, for example, we're talking about the chord built on the fifth degree, E. Now in the minor key, sometimes this chord will be minor. So for example, E minor in the key of A minor. But sometimes though, it will be major. So E major in the key of A minor. So let's start by looking at the minor version, E minor in the context of A. So this chord very much wants to resolve back to 1. So just like in the major key, the fifth chord of the key wants to take us back home. But it's a slightly more subdued sound when it's a minor chord. So this is the E minor, the minor version of the 5 chord. And although it does want to resolve back to 1, it's not so urgent, it's not so desperate. So a good example of this in context is in Losing My Religion by R.E.M., which starts on A minor and then goes to E minor, the 5 chord.
It's bigger than you are not me.
Now, as I mentioned, in the minor key, the 5th chord will often be made into a major chord. So in the key of A minor, for example, we might have E major going back to A minor, which is the 5th chord but made major. And the reason it's made major, it doesn't just come like that, is to make it into a major chord. We're actually using a note that's not in the scale. So remember, the A minor scale is all the white notes, but to have an E major chord, we get this G sharp. So it's a modification, but it's made for good reason. And that's because we want that tense pull to the one chord. A great example of it actually is in Für Elise by Beethoven, which goes A minor, then E major, the 5 chord, but major, and then goes back to 1. So it's going 1, 5, 1 in the minor key. So now let's talk about the 4 chord in the minor key. So for example, if we're in the key of E minor, that's our 1. The 4 chord would be the chord built on the 4th degree of that scale, A minor. So that's the 4 chord, that's the 1 chord. Now the 4 in the minor key has a very similar quality to the 4 in the major key, where that, if you remember from the last video, we were saying that the 4 chord wants to go back home to 1, but it's in no rush to do so. We can wait here a long time, and then eventually go back to the 1. And a good example of that is People Are Strange by The Doors, which opens with a move from E minor to A minor and back again. So it keeps going back and forth like that.
People are strange when you're a stranger, faces look ugly.
But just like how we were saying with the 5 chord in the minor key, sometimes we use the major version and sometimes we use the minor version of the chord, it's kind of the same with the 4 chord here. Although slightly less common than the 5 change, with the 4 chord, if we were in the key of F minor, for example, the 4 chord by default is B flat minor. 1, 4, 1. But sometimes you might see the major version of that 4 chord used instead. So that would be F minor, moving to B flat major. And that suddenly has this slightly more bright sound. We're still minor, but with a sudden ray of sunshine, a sort of sun breaking through the clouds sort of moment. And a good example of that is the chorus of Mad World, originally by Tears for Fears, but also made famous by Gary Jules.
Kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are
The next chord we're going to talk about is the 6th chord in the minor key. So in the key of A minor, we're talking about the chord F in the key of A minor. Now this chord has a sense of movement to it. It's a great chord to go to in the minor key when you want to move things forward, because on this chord, we can stay here for a while, but we do ultimately need to go back to the 1 chord if we're going to get that sense of resolution. But it's a great place to go to and then travel back from. A great example of this in the key of A minor is the song Californication by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which is in the key of A minor and then goes to F, the 6th chord. Also, now is the time to mention a little frustrating rule, I guess, with Roman numerals in the minor key. Confusingly, there's 2 different overlapping systems of how to label minor key chords with Roman numerals. So with the 6th chord here, we could label it purely as 6 like this, and it would be saying the 6th chord of the minor scale. Or we could label it like this, flat 6, and it's referring back to the major scale. Now you might be thinking, well, yeah, we're talking about the minor key, the minor scale, so let's use this system that's referencing the minor scale. And that makes sense as long as everybody knows we're in the minor key. But in practice, songs can sometimes move between major and minor. It can sometimes not be completely apparent if they're in major or minor. So I tend to go towards this other system where we always assume it's major key, major scale, and we reference from there. Like many things on music theories, there's disagreement on how this should be done, but I'm going to stick to the major scale system throughout this video. Now the next chord we're going to look at is actually quite a rare, unusual chord to find in the minor key, and it has a very distinctive flavour for that very reason. So we just looked at the major version of the 6th chord in the key, which is a very common chord. So in the key of G minor, for example, we're talking about the chord built on the 6th degree, E flat. E flat in the context of G minor. That's the normal 6th chord, the major 6th chord. We just talked about it, the Californication chord. What I'm talking about now is this chord, the minor version of that chord, E flat minor in the key of G minor. And it has a very, in my mind, sort of spooky, haunted house sound. Intimidating, dark, disconcerting, and that comes across very much in the most sort of famous usage of this chord that I'm aware of, which is the Imperial March from Star Wars, the Darth Vader theme. If you've always wanted to learn how to play the piano, or you already play piano but don't know how to read sheet music, then today's sponsor is going to be really helpful for you. It's Timbro, an app that guides you through learning how to play piano whilst learning how to read notation, and it's completely free to get started. Timbro listens to you as you play, giving you instant feedback on whether you're playing it correctly. I find the layout of Timbro really easy to understand. It's sort of really clear and vivid on the page, much less intimidating than sheet music in a book. Timbro is available on both Android and iPhone, and it's completely free to get started, so do check it out today and see if you can make some progress on learning how to sight read and learning how to play the piano. The next chord we're going to look at is the 2 chord of the minor key. And this one's interesting because without even going outside of the key, still using the notes of the key, the scale, it's not a major chord and it's not a minor chord, it's a diminished chord. So for example, in the key of C sharp minor, the chord built in the 2nd degree is D sharp diminished. To me, it has a very serious, sinister sound. It almost sounds very classical, I think. It's a sound more typical of the classical style. Now, the reason I'm playing in C sharp minor here is because that is the key of the example I'm going to give you, which is Because by the Beatles, which has this chord progression where we start on the 1 chord of C sharp minor, and then we go up to that D sharp diminished chord.
Because the world is round, it turns me on.
So that's the diatonic 2 chord, the 2 chord that comes naturally in the key, which happens to be a diminished chord. So in the key of A minor, the 2 chord is organically, diatonically, a diminished chord, B diminished in this example. But you could instead have a B minor there, so the minor version of the 2 chord. So for example, if you're in A minor, you could then go to B minor. And it has a slightly curious sound, because here we are going outside of the key, we're actually going into the Dorian scale, the Dorian mode, which has a slight whimsical edge, a curious tone, while still being minor. Now, a couple of examples you could use for this. The solo of Light My Fire by The Doors is based on a continuing vamp of A minor going to B minor. But another great example of the minor 2 chord in the minor key is the song 505 by the Arctic Monkeys, which continuously, throughout its entire duration, is just going back and forth from D minor, the tonic chord, 1, to E minor, the minor version of the 2 chord.
I'm going back to 505 if it's a 7 hour.
So that's 505 using the minor version of the 2 chord in the minor key, so E minor in the key of D minor. But another type of 2 chord that you could encounter in the minor key, albeit much rarer, is the major version of the 2 chord. So if we're in the key of D minor again, and we went to E major, that is the major version of the 2 chord. Quite an unusual sound. It sounds quite classical, I think, because I think that is really one of the main contexts in which you hear it. And to be honest, if a chord progression sounds classical, a good place to find it in a rock song is in a Muse song. Muse love anything that sounds classical. So a great example of this chord in practice is from the song Sing for Absolution by Muse, which starts on the chord D minor, then goes to B flat, which is the 6th chord in the key, and then goes to E major, the 2 chord, the major 2 chord in the key of D minor. A chord that you'll often encounter in the minor key is the 7 chord, so the chord G in the key of A minor. The 7 chord sort of provides an alternative to the 5 chord. So traditionally, moving from 5 to 1 would be how you sort of resolve a song. But moving from 7 to 1 is a different type of resolution, of cadence. I think of it as almost like a sort of softer, more folksy sort of resolution. And a great example of this G in the key of A minor, the 7 chord in the minor key, is in Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. But at the end of the verse, we have the sort of cadence of the lyric heaven is moving from G to A minor. So we're getting a perfect example of that resolution, that movement from 7 to 1.
The stairway to heaven.
The next chord we're looking at is the 3rd chord of the minor key. So if we're in A minor, the 3rd chord of the key is C. A minor, that's the 1, C, that's the 3. Now the quality of the 3rd chord of the minor key, of C in the key of A minor, is almost like an alternative tonic, an alternative resting point. So just like how in the major key we were saying how the 6th chord provides an alternative tonic, it's like the opposite going on here. When we're in the minor key on A minor, what was the 6th chord in the key of C, so C relative minor is A minor. Now that we're in A minor, C provides a relative major, another place in the key where we feel a sense of resolution. But if we're in the minor key, it will not be an absolute sense of resolution because we'll still get a better and more fulfilling sense of resolution moving to the tonic chord, A minor, in this case. And a great example of this in a song is the song House of the Rising Sun, made most famous by the Animals, which starts on A minor and then climbs up to C. So those first 2 chords give you the context you need. A minor, the tonic chord, C, the 3rd chord of the key. The next chord we're going to look at is the flat 2 chord. So we're in the key of E flat minor here, so the flat 2 chord would effectively be E major. Technically you might want to call it F flat because the usual 2nd degree of the scale in E flat is F, and we've flattened it so it's F flat, but for simplicity's sake you can think of it as E major. So E flat, that's our 1, E natural major, that's our flat 2. So quite a sort of almost exotic sound to it. It's from what we call the Phrygian mode, which has a typically sort of Arab sort of sound, Eastern sort of sound, Middle Eastern. And a great example of this chord in practice is the song Clint Eastwood by Gorillaz, which is largely based on a vamp of the chord E flat minor, but eventually goes to the E major chord, just briefly, and then back to the E flat minor chord, the 1 chord. Another very unusual chord, perhaps one of the rarest chords you could encounter in the minor key, is the chord built on the flattened 5th degree of the scale. So if we're in the key of E minor, the chord B flat major would be our flat 5 chord. Or technically you can think about it as a sharp 4 chord. You would just call it A sharp instead. But it's the same thing, and it's just a very rare move, and you can kind of hear why people might not lean towards this. It's got a very curious sort of spooky, otherworldly sort of sound, I think. But a song that uses this chord progression extensively is Union Forever by the White Stripes, which is virtually just a constant move from E minor to B flat. And whilst we're talking about weird chords, let's talk about another weird chord that comes up very rarely, but therefore has a very distinctive sound to it, is the minor version of the 3rd chord of the minor key. So if we're in the key of C minor, and we went to E flat minor, we're once again getting that weird sound, that weird, these chords don't really belong together sort of sound. It's actually an example of what's called a chromatic mediant. If you don't know what that is, check out my video about it. But a great example of this chord is in Enjoy the Silence by Depeche Mode, which is in C minor, but we move to the E flat minor chord, the minor version of the 3 chord.
Words like violence break the silence, come crashing into my little world, painful to me, pierce right through me.
And the last chord I want to show you is actually the major version of the 1 chord. So in the key of B minor, for example, if we went to B major, which you might think, well, are we still in the minor key if we're getting a B major chord? And the thing is, we can still be in the minor key and yet have a major version of the tonic chord. There's a couple of contexts in which it might happen. The most common is what's referred to as a Picardy third, where a piece of music or a passage of music in the minor key resolves instead to the major version of the 1 chord. It's a very typical sound in Baroque music like Bach, for example, but also we can find it in modern music like Exit Music for a Film by Radiohead, which is in B minor, but at the end of the song it resolves to B major instead, and we get this sudden surprising moment of brightness. The song sounds resolved, so we know we're on the 1 chord, but it's not the minor resolution we would have expected, it's a major resolution instead.
We hope that you choke, that you choke.
So now we've reached a time where I'm going to play you some chord progressions. I'm going to play some chord progressions in the minor key, and you have to identify what the chords are. Now I'm going to keep the whole thing in A minor. All of the chord progressions we'll hear will be in A minor, just to keep things a little bit simpler. But anyway, here comes the first chord progression that you'll have to identify by ear. What do you think? Well, we started on A minor, the tonic chord, 1, and then the next chord was D minor, the 4 chord. Then we went to the 6th chord, F major. And then finally we went to the major version of the 5 chord, and we can really feel that pull. Remember, the major version of the 5 chord really wants to resolve back to 1, which is what we did. So we had A minor, D minor, F, E, 1, 4, 6, 5 in the minor key. And that actually happens to be the same chord progression that we get in Amy Winehouse's song Back to Black, in case you sort of recognized it. But anyway, let's have the next chord progression, once again in the key of A minor. That's it. I'll play it one more time. We had there A minor, 1, then G, 7, D minor, the 4 chord, and then back to 1. Okay? So hopefully you're 2 for 2. Do let me know in the comments how you get on with this. We're going to have 3 more chord progressions to guess. Alright, so there we had A minor, the 1 chord, then we had B diminished, the 2 chord, then C, the 3 chord, D minor, the 4 chord, and then E major, the major version of the 5 chord. So we were literally climbing up the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What do we have there? Well, This time we didn't start on the tonic chord because although we are in A minor, we don't have to start on the chord A minor. Chord progressions don't have to start on the tonic. Instead, we started on the 4 chord, D minor, then climbed up to the 5 chord, E major. Then we had A minor, tonic chord, and 7, G. Then again, D minor, the 4 chord, E, 5 chord, and back to 1, the A minor chord. Okay, so that takes us to the last chord progression I'm going to perform for you, and this one will be a harder one. So once again in the key of A minor, tell me what these chords are. All right, what do we have there? Well, although in the key of A minor, we once again didn't start on our tonic chord, we instead started on the 6th chord, F major, then went to our tonic chord, A minor, then went to G, the 7 chord, then we went to a kind of unusual chord, the flat 2 chord, the Clint Eastwood chord from Gorillaz, then went back to F, which is the 6th chord, and then finally back to A minor, the 1 chord. So if you got full marks on those chord progressions, particularly that last one, then well done to you. Do let me know in the comments how you got on. And remember, if you haven't checked out the previous version of this video I did, the one about the major key, then definitely check that one out as well.